The notification on Clara's phone didn't make a sound, but in the pitch-black silence of their master bedroom, the screen lit up like a spotlight on a crime scene. Ethan knew he shouldn't look, but when he saw the name, a man he considered a brother, and the intimate preview of the message, the warmth in his chest turned to ice. He didn't scream, and he didn't wake her. Instead, he realized that the only way to win a game this rigged was to stop playing entirely. If you find yourself drawn to the quiet devastation of secrets kept and the long, lonely road to redemption, stay with me, because the silence is often louder than the truth. The notification on the bedside table didn't make a sound. It was the light that woke him, a harsh, artificial pulse of white in the velvet darkness of the master bedroom. Ethan Caldwell blinked, his eyes adjusting to the familiar silhouette of the Manhattan skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Beside him, Clara shifted, her breathing deeply rhythmic, a testament to a conscience that was either perfectly clear or terrifyingly absent. He turned his head on the pillow, intending to ignore the phone, but the screen was still glowing, and the preview message was etched there with razor-sharp clarity. Julian, missing you already. He doesn't look at you the way I do. Tomorrow night? The air in the room seemed to vanish. Ethan lay perfectly still. His heart didn't hammer against his ribs. Instead, it slowed, a heavy, dull thudding that echoed in his ears like a funeral drum. Julian, his business partner, the man who had toasted to their 10th anniversary just 3 weeks ago, raising a glass of vintage scotch with a smile that now seemed predatory. Ethan looked at Clara. In the pale moonlight, she looked ethereal. Her dark hair fanned out across the silk pillowcase. She looked like the woman he had built his entire life around, the reason he worked 80-hour weeks, the muse behind his most inspired architectural designs. But as he watched her sleep, the image fractured. She wasn't his wife anymore. She was a stranger sharing his bed, dreaming of another man while lying in the sheets Ethan paid for. He carefully, slowly, rolled out of bed. The floorboards of the Tribeca loft, usually warm underfoot, felt like ice. He walked to the living room, the space vast and impeccably decorated, filled with the art Clara had curated. Every painting, every sculpture, every piece of furniture felt like a lie. He poured himself a glass of water at the kitchen island, but didn't drink it. He just stared at the reflection of the city lights on the granite surface. Rage would have been the normal reaction. He should have stormed back into the bedroom, shaken her awake, and demanded answers. He should have thrown the phone against the wall. But Ethan was an architect. He understood structure. He understood that when a foundation is terminally compromised, you don't patch the cracks. You condemn the building. He walked into his home office and opened his laptop. The blue light washed over his face, revealing a calm that was far more dangerous than anger. He logged into their joint accounts. Then his private brokerage. Then the firm's operating ledger. He began to type. It wasn't a frenzy of keystrokes. It was methodical, deliberate. He transferred his personal liquid assets into an offshore holding account he had set up years ago for a project that never materialized. He scheduled a liquidation of his stock options for the opening bell. He drafted an email to legal, invoking the silent partner exit clause, a loophole Julian had laughed about when they signed the papers, saying they'd never need it. By 4:00 a.m., Ethan was virtually a ghost. He closed the laptop and went to the walk-in closet. He didn't take the Louis Vuitton luggage. He took an old gym duffel bag from the back shelf. He packed 3 days of clothes, his passport, and his hard drive. He walked back to the bedroom one last time. Clara hadn't moved. She looked peaceful, innocent in her deception. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wedding band. It was platinum, simple and heavy. He placed it gently on the nightstand next to her glowing phone. The metal made a tiny clink against the glass surface. Clara stirred, murmuring something unintelligible, her hand reaching out to the empty space where he had been just an hour ago. Ethan didn't reach back. He turned toward the door, his silhouette merging with the shadows of the hallway. He didn't slam the door on his way out. He simply closed it, locking the silence inside. The elevator ride down to the lobby took exactly 45 seconds. Ethan counted each floor indicator as it lit up, a descending countdown to the end of his former life. When the doors slid open, the lobby was silent, smelling of floor wax and lilies. Henry, the night concierge who had worked the desk for as long as Ethan had lived there, looked up from his tablet, startled. He glanced at the duffel bag slung over Ethan's shoulder, a stark contrast to the tailored suits and leather briefcases he was used to seeing. "Mr. Caldwell?" Henry's voice was hushed, respectful. "Everything all right? Need a car?" Ethan paused near the revolving doors. The urge to say something human, something to acknowledge the years of polite greetings, rose in his throat. But kindness felt like a liability now. "No, Henry. Just catching an early flight. Don't worry about a cab." "Should I tell Mrs. Caldwell you left, in case she calls down?" Ethan tightened his grip on the bag's strap. "No, let her sleep." He pushed through the glass doors into the biting chill of the pre-dawn Manhattan air. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, creating streaks of amber and gray. He didn't hail a taxi immediately. Instead, he walked 3 blocks south, putting physical distance between himself and the building, as if the very architecture of his home could reach out and pull him back. At the corner of Canal Street, he finally flagged a yellow cab. "JFK," Ethan said, sliding into the back seat. "International Terminal." As the city blurred past the window, Ethan pulled his phone from his pocket. It was the device that contained his entire digital existence. Emails from clients, photos of his honeymoon in Tulum, the text threads with Julian that went back 10 years. He stared at it for a long moment. It was a tether. He rolled down the window. The wind roared into the cabin, cold and loud. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the phone out onto the dark expanse of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. He didn't watch it land. He reached into his duffel and pulled out a prepaid burner he'd bought months ago for site visits in rough neighborhoods. He powered it on. The screen glowed with a default background, devoid of memories. At the airport, the anonymity was comforting. He moved through the terminal like a phantom, avoiding eye contact. He didn't go to the Delta Sky Club where he was a known regular. Instead, he sat in a hard plastic chair near a crowded gate for a red-eye to Chicago. It wasn't his final destination, but it was the first step in a zigzag route designed to confuse anyone trying to track him. He opened his laptop one last time, connecting to the airport Wi-Fi through a VPN. The resignation email he had drafted was sitting in his drafts folder. He opened it. Subject: Resignation and Equity Withdrawal. To Julian Thorne. Legal debt. Effective immediately, I am exercising my right under Section 14B of our partnership agreement to withdraw as a principal architect. My shares have been surrendered to the firm's treasury in exchange for the liquidation value as stipulated. Do not contact me. All ongoing projects are now your sole responsibility. It was brutal in its brevity. No accusations, no mention of Clara. Just business. Ethan hovered his cursor over the send button. He thought of Julian's face when he would read this in 3 hours. He thought of the panic that would ensue when the finance department realized half the operating capital was gone. He pressed send. A strange sensation washed over him. Not relief exactly, but a lightness. The weight of the lie he had been living in without knowing it was gone. He was no longer a husband. He was no longer a partner. He was just a man in a gray coat sitting in Terminal 4. He closed the laptop and stood up as the boarding call for Chicago began. He didn't look back at the skyline visible through the terminal windows. Ethan Caldwell had left the building. Clara woke to the kind of silence that feels heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on the duvet. She stretched an arm out, her hand seeking the familiar warmth of Ethan's back, but she met only cool, crisp linen. She frowned, blinking against the morning sun that was already too bright, too accusatory. She sat up. The bathroom door was open, the lights off. No sound of the shower. No smell of espresso drifting from the kitchen. "Ethan?" Her voice sounded thin in the cavernous room. She checked her phone. 9:15 a.m. He never left without waking her, or at least leaving a note on the pillow. She swung her legs out of bed, a flicker of annoyance rising in her chest. Maybe he had an early site visit and forgot to mention it. It wouldn't be the first time work consumed him, a fact she had used to justify her own transgressions for months. Her eyes drifted to the nightstand. It took her brain a moment to process what she was seeing. Her phone was plugged in where she left it, but right next to it, resting on the glass surface with mocking precision, was a platinum band, Ethan's wedding ring. Clara froze. She reached out and touched it. It was cold. He never took it off. Not for the gym, not for showers, not for sleep. The sight of it sitting there, abandoned, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her veins that was far sharper than caffeine. She grabbed her phone and dialed his number. It didn't ring. "The subscriber you are calling is not available." She dialed again. Same result. Panic began to coil in her stomach. She stood up and walked quickly to the closet. His side was neat but sparse. She checked the shelves. His favorite duffel bag was gone. His passport, which usually sat in the leather valet tray on the dresser, was missing. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." She called Julian. Her fingers trembled as she pressed his name. This was risky, calling her lover to ask about her husband, but she needed to know if Ethan was at the firm. "Clara?" Julian's voice wasn't smooth or flirtatious. It was breathless, tight. "I can't talk. It's chaos here." "Is Ethan there?" she demanded, gripping the phone. "No," Julian snapped. "He's not here. Clara, did he say anything to you last night? Did you fight?" "No. We went to bed like normal. Why? What's happening?" "He resigned," Julian said, the words sounding foreign. "He sent an email at 5 o'clock a.m. He liquidated his shares, Clara. He triggered the silent partner clause. He's gone, and he took half the operating capital with him." Clara sank onto the edge of the bed. The room spun. Resigned? Ethan lived for that firm. It was his child. "He left his ring," she whispered, more to herself than to Julian. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Julian spoke again, his voice was quieter, stripped of the arrogance she found so attractive. "If he left the ring, and he gutted the accounts, Clara, he knows." The call ended, but Clara held the phone to her ear for a long time. The next 24 hours were a blur of nausea and denial. She paced the apartment. She checked the joint bank accounts and found them drained to the exact penny of 50%. She waited for the door to open, for him to walk in and tell her it was a mistake, a breakdown, anything. But the door stayed closed. By the second day, the silence was unbearable. She had to do something. She had to pretend she didn't know why he left. She put on a coat, masked her terror with makeup, and went to the nearest precinct. The detective who took her statement was polite but weary. He looked at the bank records she provided, the email Julian had forwarded. "Mrs. Caldwell," the detective said gently, closing the file, "your husband isn't missing. Not in the legal sense. He withdrew his own money. He sent a resignation letter. He took his passport. There's no sign of foul play." "But he didn't tell me," Clara pleaded, her voice cracking. "He just vanished." "That's not a crime, ma'am. the detective said. "It's a divorce or a separation. Adults are allowed to walk away." Clara walked out of the station into the gray afternoon. The city moved around her, taxis honking, tourists laughing, the relentless energy of New York. But she felt completely hollowed out. He wasn't dead. He wasn't hurt. He had simply erased her. She hailed a cab back to Tribeca. As she sat in the back, she looked down at her hands. She was still wearing her diamond ring. It felt heavy, like a shackle. He knew. He had seen something, heard something, and instead of fighting for her, instead of screaming, he had simply deemed her not worth the argument. She had ghosted his heart for months. Now, he was ghosting her life. 5 years is a long time in a city like Seattle. It's enough time for the rain to wash away the traces of who you used to be, layer by microscopic layer. On the 40th floor of the Obsidian Corp headquarters, Ethan Caldwell stood staring out at the gray expanse of Puget Sound. The reflection in the glass was no longer the man who had fled New York in a panic. That man had been softer, eager to please, desperate for connection. The man in the window was harder, carved from the same steel and reinforced concrete that defined his architectural empire. He wore a dark charcoal suit, bespoke and sharply tailored, with no tie. His hair was shorter, flecked with gray at the temples. Not from age, but from the relentless, grinding pressure he had voluntarily placed on his own shoulders. "The Tokyo bid is secured, sir." Ethan didn't turn around. He recognized the voice of his executive assistant, Sarah. She was efficient, brilliant, and knew better than to expect small talk. "And the valuation?" Ethan asked, his voice low. $800 million. With the completion of the Eco Campus in Austin, Obsidian will cross the unicorn threshold by Q3. Ethan nodded once. $1 billion valuation. It was an astronomical number, a figure that would have made the old Ethan light a cigar and call Julian to celebrate. But the new Ethan felt nothing but a cool, detached satisfaction. It was just leverage. It was armor. "Good. Prepare the file for the New York expansion. We announce next month." "Are you sure about New York, Ethan?" Sarah hesitated. She was the only one who knew a fraction of his history, mostly gleaned from the legal firewall he had erected around his personal life. "There are variables there." "The variables are irrelevant," Ethan said, finally turning. His eyes were cold. "New York is just a market, and markets are made to be conquered." 3,000 miles away, the sun was setting over a very different scene in Chelsea. Clara stood in the corner of a crowded gallery opening, clutching a glass of warm white wine. The room was loud, filled with the vapid chatter of the art world's B-list. 5 years ago, Clara would have been the center of this room. She would have been the one discovering the artist, the one shaking hands with collectors, the one everyone wanted to be near. Now, she was just a guest, and not even a VIP one. "Clara, darling!" A woman in a loud floral caftan swept past, barely slowing down. "So good to see you out. Still at that little pop-up space on the Lower East Side?" "It's a boutique gallery, Linda," Clara said, her smile brittle. "We focus on emerging talent." Of course. "Brave of you," Linda said, her eyes already scanning the room for someone more important. "Give my best to—" "Oh, never mind." She floated away, leaving the unfinished sentence hanging in the air like a foul odor. "Give my best to your husband?" No one asked that anymore. They knew. Everyone knew. The scandal hadn't been explosive. It had been a slow, suffocating rot. When Ethan vanished, Julian had panicked. The firm took a massive hit, and in his desperation to save face, Julian had distanced himself from everything connected to the disaster, including Clara. The affair, which had seemed so electric in the shadows, withered instantly in the harsh light of reality. Without Ethan as the common enemy, without the thrill of the forbidden, They realized they didn't even like each other. Julian had moved to London a year later. Clara had stayed, paralyzed by the hope that Ethan might walk through the door, or perhaps paralyzed by the fear that he wouldn't. She sipped her wine, feeling the headache that had become her constant companion. She checked her phone. No messages, no missed calls. Just an email from her landlord reminding her that the rent for the gallery space was increasing next month. She was 35 years old. She was still legally married to a ghost. She had sold the Tribeca loft 2 years ago to cover debts and moved into a small one-bedroom in Brooklyn. Her life, once expansive and full of light, had shrunk to the size of a postage stamp. She looked around the room at the laughing faces, the couples holding hands, the secure, confident people who hadn't blown up their lives for a cheap thrill. A wave of exhaustion hit her, so profound she almost dropped her glass. "I need a win," she whispered to the empty air. "Just one win." She didn't know it yet, but across the country, a man made of obsidian and silence was about to give her exactly what she asked for. But in Ethan's world, a win for him meant a loss for everyone else. The email arrived on a Tuesday, buried between a spam offer for cheap framing supplies and a final notice from Con Edison. Clara almost deleted it. The subject line was stark, devoid of the usual promotional fluff. Request for proposal, venue acquisition for Obsidian Corp launch event. She frowned, adjusting her reading glasses, a new necessity brought on by years of squinting at spreadsheets that never balanced. Obsidian Corp. The name had been circulating in the art world for months. A tech architecture hybrid based in Seattle, rumored to be buying up half of Hudson Yards for a new East Coast headquarters. They were the kind of client that could make a gallery's entire fiscal year in a single night. Why on earth were they emailing her? Clara's gallery, The Aperture, was a converted warehouse space on the fringe of the Lower East Side. It was charming in a gritty way, but it wasn't the Met, and it certainly wasn't Gagosian. Curiosity won out. She clicked the link. The RFP was professional, intimidatingly precise, and requested a venue that could host an intersection of art, technology, and architectural brutalism. The budget line was left blank, simply stating, "to be determined by vision." "It's a mass email," she muttered to the empty room. "They probably scraped a database of every gallery with a business license." But as she scrolled down, her breath hitched. Under the Specific Requirements section, there was a note. "We are looking for a space with history, resilience, and a director capable of managing high-profile discretion." Clara looked around her silent gallery. The walls were hung with abstract pieces by a local student she was trying to mentor. The floorboards were scuffed, but the bones of the building were good. Cast iron pillars, exposed brick. It had resilience. God knows, she had resilience. She spent the next 3 days in a fever state. She ignored the unpaid bills. She ignored the calls from her mother asking when she was going to fix her situation. She poured everything she had left into the proposal. She staged photos of the space at golden hour. She drafted a menu, a lighting concept, a flow for the VIPs. She hit send at 11:59 p.m. on the deadline night, her hands trembling. 3,000 miles away, in a glass-walled conference room in Seattle, a large monitor displayed a list of 20 finalists. The names were heavyweights: the Zwirner, Pace, the Shed, and at the bottom, an outlier, the Aperture. Director, Clara Vane. "The short list is ready for your review, sir," Sarah said, placing a tablet on the polished mahogany table. "Marketing recommends the Shed. It has the capacity and the prestige. However, there's a boutique option that fits the brutalist aesthetic, but the financials are shaky." Ethan sat at the head of the table. He didn't look at the tablet. He knew the list. He had known the list before it was compiled. "Which one has shaky financials?" he asked, his voice neutral. "The Aperture. It's run by a Clara Vane. Small, struggling, but the proposal is surprisingly inspired. Ethan turned his chair slowly to face the window. Below him, the city of Seattle looked like a circuit board in the rain. He closed his eyes, and for a split second, he could smell the perfume Clara used to wear, jasmine and cedar. He could see the way she bit her lip when she was focused. He had built an empire to escape her. He had become a ghost to punish her. And yet, when the time came to return to the city that had broken him, he found himself pulling the only thread that remained. Was it mercy, or was it the darker instinct of a predator playing with its food? "We don't need prestige," Ethan said, opening his eyes. "We need a narrative, a space that understands what it means to rebuild from nothing." "So," Sarah hovered her stylus over the screen, "the shed?" "No," Ethan said softly. "Hire the aperture. Give them the contract. Full budget approval." Sarah looked surprised, but nodded efficiently. "I'll draft the letter of intent. Do you want to sign it personally?" "No. Have legal sign it. Keep my name off all documentation until the final reveal." Ethan stood up and walked to the door. He paused, his hand on the cool metal handle. "And Sarah, make sure the check clears immediately. I don't want them going under before I get there." The acceptance email hit Clara's inbox the next morning while she was making instant coffee. When she saw the attachment, a contract with a deposit figure that had more zeros than she had seen in 5 years, she didn't scream. She didn't jump. She simply slid down to the floor, her back against the dishwasher, and wept. She thought she had been saved. She had no idea she had just signed an invitation for the past to come and finish the job. The night of the gala, the Lower East Side was blanketed in a fine, persistent mist. But inside the aperture, the air was crisp and meticulously controlled. Clara moved through the gallery like a woman possessed. For the past 3 weeks, she had barely slept, orchestrating the transformation of her gritty warehouse space into a temple of high-tech minimalism. The Obsidian core team had been relentless, their demands specific to the point of absurdity. They didn't just want lighting, they wanted luminescence that mimicked the pre-dawn hour. They didn't just want catering, they wanted food that tasted like the future. It was exhausting, but it was also exhilarating. Clara felt a flicker of her old self returning, the competent, charming director who could manage million-dollar egos with a smile. "Mrs. Caldwell?" Clara flinched. She turned to see the head of the security team, a man named Marcus, who looked more like a Secret Service agent than an event guard. He was holding a clipboard. "It's Vane," Clara corrected automatically, though the name Caldwell was still legally hers. "Is everything secure?" "Perimeters locked. All guests have signed the digital NDAs. Upon entry, no phones, no cameras. The CEO requires absolute privacy until the keynote." Clara nodded, glancing at the entrance where the guests were beginning to arrive. It was a who's who of New York society, tech moguls, venture capitalists, and the very art collectors who had shunned her for years. They were all here, sipping champagne, marveling at the architecture of the space she had curated. "Who is he anyway?" Clara asked, smoothing the silk of her black dress. "This CEO, I've been working with your team for a month and I don't even have a name." Marcus didn't smile. "He prefers his work to speak for itself. He'll be here at 8 p.m. sharp." Clara walked away, feeling a strange shiver run down her spine. There was something about the aesthetic of this event that gnawed at her. The color palette was exclusively charcoal, slate, and deep midnight blue. The flowers were rare black calla lilies. The ambient music was a low, resonant cello composition that sounded hauntingly familiar. It reminded her of the playlists Ethan used to listen to when he was drafting late at night. It reminded her of the way he used to say, "Silence is the only luxury left, Clara." She shook her head, forcing the thought away. Paranoia. That's what this was. She was projecting her guilt onto a client she had never met. Ethan was gone. He was probably building strip malls in Ohio or teaching at a community college in the Midwest. He wasn't the billionaire CEO of Obsidian Corp. "Clara, this is magnificent." She turned to see Linda, the woman from the gallery opening, now looking at Clara with renewed respect, or at least the calculating approximation of it. "Thank you, Linda," Clara said, her voice smooth. "It's been a project of passion." "I heard the deposit alone cleared your debts," Linda whispered conspiratorially, leaning in. "You really landed on your feet, didn't you? After everything." Clara felt a flash of irritation. "It's business, Linda. Pure business." "Well, whoever this man is, he certainly has taste. It feels intimate, almost like a confession." Clara stiffened. A confession. She excused herself and walked toward the back of the gallery, needing a moment of air. She stepped into the small office she had converted into a green room for the CEO. It was empty, waiting. On the table, a bottle of Japanese whiskey sat next to a single crystal tumbler. Clara stared at the bottle. Hibiki 21. It was Ethan's favorite. Impossible to find, exorbitantly expensive. Her heart began to race. The flowers, the music, the lighting, the whiskey. It was a coincidence. It had to be. Rich men liked expensive whiskey. Architects liked minimalism. She was driving herself crazy. She checked her watch. 7:55 p.m. The ambient music swelled, growing louder, more urgent. The lights in the main gallery dimmed, shifting from cool white to a deep, oceanic blue. The chatter of the crowd died down instantly, replaced by a hushed anticipation. Clara took a deep breath, checked her reflection in the mirror. She looked professional, composed, beautiful in a fragile way, and stepped back out into the gallery. She made her way to the small stage where a microphone stood waiting. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clara said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands, "welcome to the Aperture. Tonight, we are not just witnessing the launch of a headquarters, we are witnessing the return of a vision." She gestured to the balcony overlooking the main floor. The spotlight swung upward, cutting through the darkness. "Please welcome the founder and CEO of Obsidian Corp." The heavy velvet curtains on the balcony parted. A figure stepped out into the light. Clara squinted against the glare. For a moment, he was just a silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, imposing. But then he stepped forward, his face illuminated by the harsh white beam. The glass of champagne in Clara's hand slipped. It shattered on the concrete floor, the sound exploding like a gunshot in the silence. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a random billionaire. It was the man whose ring was still sitting in her nightstand drawer. The sound of the glass shattering seemed to hang in the air for an eternity, sharp and violent against the sudden quiet of the room. A few guests gasped, turning to look at Clara, expecting an apology, a laugh, a quick recovery. But Clara couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The man on the balcony looked down. He didn't flinch at the noise. He didn't look surprised. He stood with his hands resting lightly on the railing, wearing a suit that cost more than her gallery's entire annual revenue. His face was leaner, the angles sharper, his eyes framed by glasses she had never seen before. But it was him, Ethan. He looked at the broken glass on the floor, then slowly, deliberately, he lifted his gaze to meet hers. There was no anger in his eyes. There was no love. There was only a terrifying, Arctic indifference. It was the look of a man who was looking at a stranger. "Good evening," Ethan said. His voice was amplified by the speakers, deep and resonant, filling every corner of the room she had prepared for him. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Her legs turned to water. She grabbed the edge of the podium to keep from falling, her knuckles turning white. 5 years ago, Ethan continued, addressing the crowd but never breaking eye contact with Clara. I left New York with nothing but a duffel bag and a belief that structure is the only thing that survives chaos. Tonight, I return to prove that hypothesis correct. Behind him, a massive LED screen, one Clara had personally supervised the installation of, flickered to life. A collective murmur of awe swept through the room. The screen displayed a complex 3D rendering of the new Obsidian headquarters, a twisting tower of glass and greenery that defied gravity. But it wasn't the building that made the room gasp. It was the numbers scrolling beneath it. Obsidian Corp. Valuation, $1.2 billion. Founders' equity, 85%. Liquid assets, $850 million. The numbers burned into Clara's retinas. She stared at them, her mind struggling to comprehend the scale. $1 billion. He wasn't just successful. He was a titan. He was one of the most powerful men in the city, and she had traded him for a 3-month fling with a man who was now selling insurance in Connecticut. The room began to spin. The faces of the guests, Linda's smirk, Marcus's stone-faced security, the rapt attention of the investors, blurred into a kaleidoscope of gray and black. She remembered the night he left, the silence of the apartment, the ring on the nightstand. She had thought she was the one with the power then. She had thought she was the one who decided when the marriage ended. She realized now, with a clarity that was physically painful, that she had never been in control. He had let her live in the illusion of freedom while he built a fortress she could never enter. The past, Ethan said, his voice dropping an octave, is just a foundation we pour concrete over. It doesn't matter what's buried underneath. It only matters what stands on top. He finally looked away from her, turning to the screen to point out a structural detail. The disconnection was the final blow. If he had screamed at her, if he had cried, she could have handled it. But this absolute erasure of her existence? The air in the room felt too thin. The scent of the black calla lilies was suddenly cloying, suffocating. The dark blue lighting felt like deep water closing over her head. "Ethan," she whispered, but the word died in her throat. Her grip on the podium slipped. The floor rushed up to meet her. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Ethan's back, turned toward the future, unbothered by the sound of her falling. When Clara opened her eyes, the world was soft and muted. She was lying on a leather sofa, the smell of expensive leather and antiseptic filling her nose. She sat up too quickly, the room tilting slightly. She recognized the space immediately. It was the small office she had converted into the green room. The bottle of Hibiki 21 was still on the table, unopened. And Ethan was standing by the window, his back to her, watching the rain streak against the glass. For a moment, Clara thought she was dreaming. The silhouette was so familiar, so painfully, achingly Ethan. She swung her legs off the sofa, her heels clicking softly on the floor. "Ethan?" He didn't turn around. He didn't tense up. He simply checked his watch, a movement so casual it felt like an insult. "You were out for 10 minutes, he said. His voice was calm, devoid of the theatrical projection he had used on the balcony. It was just him. Marcus cleared the room. They think it was exhaustion, a side effect of your dedication to the event. "Ethan," Clara said again, her voice trembling. She took a step toward him. You're here." "I am," he said, finally turning. Up close, the changes were even more apparent. The lines around his eyes were deeper. The softness that used to make him smile at her bad jokes was gone, replaced by a granite-hard stoicism. He looked at her not with hatred, but with a clinical assessment, as if she were a building inspection that had failed code. "Why?" Clara whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Why did you do this? Why hire me? Why come back like this?" Because I needed a venue, Ethan said simply, and you needed the money. It wasn't about the money, Clara cried, the dam finally breaking. I needed to know you were alive. I needed to explain. Ethan raised a hand, stopping her. It wasn't a violent gesture, but it was absolute. There is nothing to explain, Clara. I read the text. I saw the timestamps. I know exactly what happened. But I didn't love him, she pleaded, taking another step. It was a mistake. A stupid, reckless mistake. I was insecure, Ethan. You were always working, always building, and I felt invisible. Julian made me feel seen. And now? Ethan asked, his voice soft. Do you feel seen now? Clara froze. The question hung in the air, cruel and precise. She looked at him, realizing the trap he had set. He had made her the center of attention, the architect of this perfect event, only to reveal that she was just a hired hand in his grand design. I'm sorry, she whispered, the fight draining out of her. I am so sorry. I've missed you every single day for 5 years. Ethan watched her for a long moment. For a split second, something flickered in his eyes, a ghost of the old pain, a shadow of the man who had left his ring on the nightstand. But then, just as quickly, the steel shutter came down. I know, he said, but missing someone doesn't change what you did to them. He walked over to the table and picked up a thick manila envelope that Clara hadn't noticed before. He held it out to her. What is this? She asked, afraid to touch it. The buyout for the gallery, Ethan said. It's a generous offer. Enough to clear your debts, buy a new space, maybe start over somewhere else, somewhere far away. Clara took the envelope. It felt heavy. She opened the flap and pulled out the documents. On top was a check. The amount was staggering, but underneath it was a legal document bound in blue paper. Petition for dissolution of marriage. She looked up at him, her heart shattering all over again. You waited, she whispered. You waited 5 years to give me this? I waited until I could afford to make sure you wouldn't contest it, Ethan said, buttoning his jacket. And I waited until I no longer cared what your answer would be. He walked toward the door. He didn't look back. He didn't offer a final goodbye. He simply opened the door, letting in the muffled sounds of the party outside, the clinking of glasses, the laughter, the applause for a man who had won everything except the woman standing in the room. Ethan, Clara called out, desperate, clutching the papers to her chest. Does it imply anything? That you came back to me? Ethan paused in the doorway. He looked at the gallery beyond, at the empire he had built from the ashes of their marriage. No, Clara, he said, his voice fading into the ambient cello music. It just proves that I'm a better architect than I was a husband. I know how to finish a project. The door clicked shut. Clara stood alone in the green room. In one hand, she held a check for $5 million. In the other, she held the end of her life. She looked at the bottle of Hibiki whiskey, the only thing he had left behind. She sat back down on the sofa, placed the papers on the table, and poured herself a drink. The silence in the room was absolute, and for the first time in 5 years, she finally understood what he meant. The silence wasn't empty. It was the sound of a door locking. Forever.